Cutoffs in Coffee, episode 32. Welcome back. We are your hosts, James and CT from T3 Performance. And we have, as always, an awesome conversation with you. Today on episode 32, we have Special Agent John Breen. So you're going to hear John's story here as we move forward, but just a little information about him is he is a native of Bronx, New York. And in 1999, he graduated magna cum laude from the University of Rhode Island, earning a Bachelor of Science degree in computer science. Excuse me, I'm so hyped up from the conversation we have that I'm having trouble reading. Upon graduation, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant into the United States Army Military Police Corps. Special Agent Breen is also an assault team leader on the Special Weapons and Tactics team, that is the SWAT team, a firearms instructor, tactical instructor, active shooter instructor, and defensive tactics instructors. You could imagine just reading that short resume, this conversation is incredible, and I know you're going to enjoy it.
And today's episode is brought to you by the Underdogg Fitness Heel Elevator or Squat Wedge. So this piece of equipment is a must-have if you are doing any type of squat. And this is one of those things that we've talked about in different episodes, but we do touch on it in this episode specifically with what John has shifted in his training philosophies as he's gotten older and had to maintain that high level of performance. So why we elevate our heels in a short sentence is to help us get better range and feel better in that deep squat. This Underdogg heel wedge is the best way to do it. It's durable. It is heavy, so it won't move around, so you feel comfortable lifting some heavy weights with it. Check it out at underdogfitness.com.
And if you like what we're doing here on the Cutoffs and Coffee podcast, you can support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel, also following us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify podcasts. And you can also follow our individual social medias and our gym social media at T3 Performance, where a lot of times we like to put out information about guests we're having and give you, the listener, an opportunity to ask questions to these guests. So without further ado, episode 32, John Breen. Just wanted to let you know, if you like what John's talking about and you want to see John in action, John trains with us, coaches James and CT at T3 Performance out here in Avon, Ohio. If you are new to the podcast and you're in the area, please check us out for all your training needs. We are there over there, T3 Performance, Avon, Ohio. Okay, here we go. Episode 32, Cutoffs and Coffee with John Breen, Special Agent John Breen. Enjoy. John Breen, welcome to the show. This is a long time coming. We appreciate you coming on Cutoffs and Coffee today. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that since day one, 31 episodes ago, James and I were talking about some guests we wanted to come on, and John was one of them. So we're excited to finally be able to get this thing going and have this conversation. John, before we get the listeners, to learn everything about you, we want to learn a little something. James and I, who know you pretty well, we'd like to learn a little something new about you, and also, something for the listeners. What do you think is something that we need to know about you that we can't find from a quick John Breen Google search?
Well, you could see it sitting on the top of my head is that I'm a big Yankees fan. So I get a lot of hate in Cleveland, but it's something that brings me back to my childhood. I grew up in the Bronx, and as a child, I was a big Yankees fan. It was in the era of Don Mattingly, Ricky Henderson, Dave Winfield. Definitely shows my age there. A lot of your listeners may not even know who they are, or they know Don Mattingly, the coach, not the player. But it was a great experience. It's at a very young age, I feel like it exposed me to a lot, living in New York City and growing up there, and some good and even some bad. It brings me back to a story of when I was probably like 16, 17 years old, and I was outside of my friend's house, and we loved working on our trucks. And while we were outside, we heard this engine rev on a car, and we look up, and there is an Acura Legend speeding down the street. And my friend yells to this little kid who jumped out of the way, and the car crashed. And airbags go off, and next thing you know, you have these two kids jumped out. They're probably a couple years older than us, probably around 20. And they take off running. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, but me and my friends start chasing after them. And, we go a couple blocks, and his house was right near 95, and you can imagine traffic in New York City, the highway's not moving as fast as it normally does. And these kids scale the fence, and like a movie, they jump on the back of a flatbed truck, and they kind of get away. My friend's dad pulls up in his car. We jump in there and we keep going, and we get on the highway and we go down and we're looking for them. And next thing you know, we see the kids walking along the side of the road, the side of the highway. So we jump out and they just run across the highway, don't even look. I remember to this day, one of the kids almost got killed by the tractor trailer. It jammed on its brakes, and we waited till it was safe and ran after them. And unfortunately, to make a long story short, we lost these two guys in the backyard, some neighborhood. And shortly thereafter, a bunch of detectives showed up and they picked my friends up, and he and I went around looking for these kids, and we ended up back in the precinct. And I remember very vividly the cop, was telling us, couldn't believe what we did, but what set out to me, he said, "Hey, you should consider a career in law enforcement." And that stuck with me. And here I am 25 years later, special agent in the FBI, and doing that job.
James, you're up. Any stories similar?
We played tag in our backyard, in our cul-de-sac, and I was pretty good. And they were like, "You should do sports."
Yeah. things were different growing up in Carmel, Indiana too. That's for sure. John, ever get to find that guy again and tell him? How interesting would that be? Like, hey, remember the conversation we had?
Those guys are, we never caught him, and I don't know if the police ever did, but I still am good friends with, his name's Anthony. He's still one of my close friends to this day.
Wow. Yeah, that's a cool story to kick it off. How about our kind of second opening question before we get into the rest of your story? Can you remember, or can you think of the last skill that you learned or taught yourself, or something that you're currently working on?
Yeah, so I like to learn. I try about once a year to learn new skills. I think it makes us better as instructors and teachers, right? We can get back to that beginner's mindset. And something I'm working on right now is becoming better at shooting with my red dot. So for many years, probably over 20 years, I've shot a pistol, carried a pistol professionally for work. And, over the past few months, we recently deployed new weapons that have essentially a red dot sight attached to the top of them. And, unlike a rifle, the learning curve on a rifle is very easy. You put a red dot on, it's a very easy thing to kind of transition to. But with a pistol, it takes quite some time to get used to that, and a lot of reps. And the analogy I tell people is take a little square, maybe 1 inch by 1 inch, put it in your pocket, and then try to pull it out of your pocket and stick it in front of your eye in about 1.5 seconds, and make sure that that's framing whatever you're trying to hit. And you can imagine it's very difficult to do that. It takes a lot of repetitions to get that movement down. So I've been working very hard on that. I like to use the adage, practice doesn't make perfect, but perfect practice makes perfect. And trying to do different reps to get better at that skill.
Now, any reason why you're switching to a red dot as opposed to traditionally using iron sights? Is there some, reason behind that?
Yeah. So iron sights are great. And some people to this day will, debate, and some people don't want to switch. And one of the reasons is when you present a pistol, having those iron sights on the gun, that gives you a visual reference to make corrections as when you draw and present your pistol, that gives you that visual reference to make those micro adjustments, where when you have the red dot, your mechanics have to be very, very good every time. But the benefit of the red dot is there's several benefits from it. The first is being what we call threat focused. So when you shoot with iron sights, your eyes have to focus on the sights. So, our eyes work like if you ever used one of those old video cameras, where it had a manual focus. if you notice, when you focus a lens, it can only focus on one distance at a time. So with shooting a pistol with iron sights, one of the downsides is, you have to focus on your sights. And unfortunately, it may work well on a shooting range, but when you go into real life, we tend to focus on the threat, right? So the red dot, on the other hand, it allows you to actually focus on the threat and superimpose the dot on the threat. The other benefit, it does allow you to shoot more accurately, and it allows you to have those follow-up shots. They can be quicker in some instances, but like I said, it's an investment, not only in money, especially if you're a civilian, and then in some training, because there is a learning curve with it.
John, let's hear about how you accumulated this knowledge. Go ahead and kind of take us back to the Bronx and tell us the John Breen story, through growing up and jumping in cars and chasing people down, to your collegiate sports career, to now your professional career and where you're at today. Kind of take us through that journey and tell us a bit about yourself.
So like I said, growing up in the Bronx, like most of you, I played all the traditional sports, football, baseball, wiffle ball, you name it, street hockey. And, we would play on the streets using cars as our end zones. And, that red Honda was the end zone, and you'd have to, move out of the way if a car was coming down the street, and had a lot of fun. But I had mixed results. I would say, when I was a younger athlete, I did pretty well. But when I got into high school, I think for a variety of reasons, which I'll talk about later on, I didn't perform very well. I had, I would say I was an average to below average in some instances. I played, in high school, I primarily played baseball and soccer. And I graduated high school, and I went to the University of Rhode Island. So I chose URI for two reasons. One is I knew I wanted to go into the military, and they had an ROTC program. And then the other is I wanted to study computer science, which is very shocking. I do a lot of public speaking, and when I tell people that I have a computer science degree, most people say I look like a landscaper, whatever that means. I in my head, I tell myself, they're just telling me that I'm tan and I'm fit, that's why I look like a landscaper. So I that's why I chose URI. So I remember, freshman year, I go, and they had kind of a fair with different sports and different clubs and opportunities. And I remember someone coming up to me and saying, "Hey, you should try the sport of rowing." And it's something I never did before. Quite honestly, I kind of heard of it, some people call it crew. And, it appealed to me for a few reasons. One, I knew it was the ultimate team sport. And I like to work out. I like fitness, so I knew I would get that. And then lastly, I really like being on the water. I grew up, despite growing up in the Bronx, my dad was a big fisherman and boater, so I spent a lot of time, out on the water, and that's something I thought, hey, it would combine some of the things I really like. And it turns out, it was something that I did fairly well at, and I really enjoyed it. And I was very lucky. My sophomore year, I had an Olympic coach. So he coached, he was our coach, but he also coached Olympic athletes in the past. He was a national team coach. And, I owe him a lot to, a lot of my athletic performance down the road, just from everything that he taught us, and one of the things that was very interesting is, I would say my perception of training was very off. The bar that I thought I was at, and I learned down the road, there's a term, the Dunning-Kruger Effect, that I learned about in a few years ago. And it's a study that they have, and they basically did some tests, and they have people that typically are low performers will tend to overestimate their proficiency at something. And then in some instances, people that are high performers will tend to underestimate their proficiency. And I think that was partially me, where I thought in high school, I thought maybe my skills were better than they are. And then the other component was my perception of what it took to be good at something at a high level. Here I was, back in high school, and I thought I knew what hard training was. I thought I knew, am I putting in the hours? And come to find out, my perception was way off. I mean, it's not till I was in college until I realized, how it took with 2-a-day workouts and just the grueling training that we went through. I mean, it was just something that was very eye-opening for me. And it really, helped me understand why I wasn't achieving the results that I wanted to. The other was, and you probably can both associate to this, is being surrounded by amazing athletes. And I had some, amazing teammates that, that adage of iron sharpens iron. They really helped brought our entire team's proficiency up. Every day was, it was a battle, it was a competition, and we all made each other, better. I also didn't really weightlift in high school. I played sports, but, in the 90s, just, it wasn't, I think if you played football, you lifted weights back then, but it wasn't like it is today. And that was another thing that really helped propel my success. I mean, between my freshman and my sophomore year, I gained over 20 pounds of muscle. And that also helped me feel like I could control my body better. Coordination, I think, was another issue. I was a late developer. I still was growing even into college. And it was amazing because I remember, I think like sophomore, junior year, I played like an intramural game of football, and I just felt amazing, even not having played, a game of football for years, but I just felt like I had so much better control over my body and my movements and my coordination. And I think, obviously developing helped, but I also think weightlifting, as you guys, would agree, helped me to be able to control and better and perform better. And then, the why. Our coach was very big. He was, 10 to 15 years, in my opinion, ahead of his game. And I think a lot of it, he worked with a lot of Eastern Bloc countries at the time. Rowing back then was dominated by a lot of those countries. And his training methodologies were interestingly enough, are being, 10 to 15 years later, becoming the popular thing to do. It's stuff we did back then in the 90s. But he was very big on explaining to us the why. And he had, and that got us to buy in and trust him as a coach. I mean, we would essentially do anything for him because we believed in him. And he was, he was a very patient coach. And he also got us to believe and understand and trust the process, and also in delayed gratification. We live in a society today, I think you guys would agree, that we have everything, immediately. We want to order something, it shows up the next day. I mean, we have all these things at our fingertips, and sometimes we get impatient and we want results immediately. And, I vividly remember even our periodization and the way he would train us and teach us technique. He would tell us, he'd be like, guys, you're going to lose races in the beginning of the season. And he's like, I don't care, and he's like, because where it mattered is our last two races. We had basically like a regionals and then a national championship race at the end of the season. And, he knew that, he wasn't going to shortcut the process. He knew that if he did that, yeah, we would run some races at the beginning of the season, but we probably would plateau mid-season, both technically and from a fitness perspective. But he got us to buy into the process. And, by the end of the year, we were beating a lot of the teams that, may have beat us in the beginning of the year. The other thing, was learning styles. I got to see, learn myself and learn, my learning style. I found out I was kind of a slow learner. It took me a lot of time to pick up a skill, but then when I did finally learn it, I felt like I was able to hone it a lot better than some of my other teammates and athletes. So had a great time in college. I mean, we had a great, especially our junior year, we did very well. And then after my senior year, I graduated, and I went into ROTC. So I graduated, and then I was commissioned as a lieutenant. But I'd like to share, before I move on to that, I'd like to share something. So in between college years, I had the opportunity to attend a few active duty schools. So I got to go to airborne school, which, taught you how to jump out of planes. And then in between my junior and senior year, I got to go to a school called Air Assault School. And this school was both physically demanding and then also academically demanding. I think the failure rate at the time was around, 50 something percent. And throughout this course, you're tested in a variety of different things. I was a cadet at the time. So being a cadet, you can imagine, I mean, I was, we instead of drill sergeant, they're called black hats. That's what the instructors, and they really, would give us a hard time being cadets. So this was an active duty school. There were about 200 soldiers in the school. And, I was one of only a handful of cadets. Everybody else was, on active duty, right? This was their permanent full-time job. And at the end of the course, the very final thing they make you do is they make you do a 12-mile ruck, where you have a 35-pound ruck, and you have to complete it in a certain amount of time. And I remember, we started out, and the first few miles I was doing pretty well, and then I started to pass people, and by the end I started to pass some Rangers, some Special Forces guys, and in the end, I ended up finishing the ruck march, probably in the top 10 out of all these guys. And, it was at that point that I was, I think I realized that all this hard training, and the mental training, mental toughness, and going through all those grueling workouts every day in college had really prepared me. And this was kind of a realization for me that how this is going to carry over into, into my military career, into my military training. So I graduated, I graduated college, and in December of '99, and then I went on active duty. So I spent about 6.5 years on active duty. I was very fortunate, got to live in a lot of nice places, and get to serve with a lot of great people, and have some interesting jobs. I mean, I was able to kind of start my SWAT career, if you may. I was a military police officer, so most military bases have essentially a police department of MPs. It looks very similar to any police department in any city. And most military bases have tactical teams, SWAT teams, or SRTs. And I got to do that for a while. And then my last two assignments was a deputy provost marshal. And then my final and probably most rewarding was being a company commander. So I had the ability to lead about 170 soldiers that were MPs and firefighters in Fort Rucker, Alabama, which was very interesting. You can imagine a guy from the Bronx living in the deep South, and my accent was a lot thicker at the time than it is now. The Midwesterners, I think you guys have beat it out of me, but it still comes out. When I say the title of your podcast, coffee, you can still hear certain words that I pronounce. So after my military career, I was fortunate enough to apply to the FBI, and I was accepted to the FBI in 2006. I went to Quantico and went through training there. and I was assigned to the Cleveland division, and that's where I've been essentially since then. So the past 15 years, I've been assigned to Cleveland. I've had some great opportunities and experiences. I've gotten to serve overseas and in some other places, and then my current job today, I would say, is broken down into basically three components. So the first component is I'm an assault team leader for our SWAT team. So, we are a SWAT team just like any other, local or state team. There are 56 field offices in the FBI, and every field office has a SWAT team of varying size depending on where it is. And we do a lot of high risk warrant service. We train, and we do other missions as well, barricaded subjects, hostage rescue. We also do protection, so dignitary protection for some of the dignitaries in the Department of Justice. The other aspect of my job is I'm an instructor, so I train firearms, defensive tactics, active shooter, and counterterrorism. So I get to do a lot of good training, and then the last part is I'm on a JTF, a Joint Terrorism Task Force. So I am an investigator for counterterrorism, and then I also serve as essentially the liaison between the FBI and all the local and state and federal agencies here in Northern Ohio.
Now, you have a incredible career of experiences, and early on, you had a paradigm shifting moment, as a college athlete, kind of like opening your eyes to, okay, hey, I thought I was training hard in high school, and like this is a new level of performance training to help me. You saw how that played out when you were, in the air assault school. Now, did you have any similar shifts as you kind of moved into more leadership roles with how you communicate to those that you're responsible for instructing or leading, that kind of changed the way you thought about how instruction works or how leadership works, in practice?
Yeah, so I'm very big into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Probably about 10 years ago. So I early on in my FBI career, I became a defensive tactics instructor, and like any course, I mean, you can relate, if you went to some sort of seminar to get certified as some sort of strength and conditioning coach, we all probably agree that's kind of the bare minimum of what you need to kind of continue on, but ultimately you have to train and continue on your own. So I got into jiu-jitsu as a way to kind of help build that proficiency. And years later, I was very fortunate where I got to train with the Gracies. I got to go to some of their training, and they opened my eyes. The Gracies are very well known, right? If you've followed, back in the UFC, Royce Gracie was very well known, and the Gracie family kind of brought Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to the United States. And luckily, thanks to Joe Rogan and Jocko Willink, they've definitely made Jiu-Jitsu a lot more popular, and people have become more aware of it. And I would say, while the Gracies are very, very skilled, and they know, their techniques and their ability are absolutely amazing. But the one thing that I think a lot of people don't understand is, especially the Gracies in California, Henner, Hidon, and their dad, Horian, they're phenomenal teachers. And I had a very, that paradigm that you talk about, when I went through one of their courses, and they were talking about, a concept called one-on-one retention. So they were training and teaching us, how to better teach and communicate with, an athlete or a student. And they did a demonstration that to this day stands out in my mind. So Horian Gracie, he called up two of the students from the class, and he told the one student, you're going to have the instructor role. And then he had the other student put a blindfold on, and he took a Gatorade bottle and he carried it across the room, and he set it down on the floor. And the next thing he did is he instructed, and he said, I want you to teach or instruct this blindfolded student to go and find the water bottle, a Gatorade bottle, and pick it up. So the student, starts out, that's playing the instructor, and, he tells the student, okay, take 3 steps forward, take 2 steps right, take 5 more steps forward, turn 45 degrees to your left. Okay, squat down. And he gave very, precise verbal instructions that were, very easy to understand. I mean, very clear. And everyone thought he did a great job. The student, blindfolded student, he found the Gatorade bottle and picked it up. So Horian then said, okay, I'm going to now act as the instructor. So he kept the student that was blindfolded, and then he had the other student move the Gatorade bottle to another location. And next thing you know, he takes and he grabs the student's hand that's blindfolded, and he walks him over and he touches his hand to the Gatorade bottle. So you can imagine the shock on all of our faces, and just to, being open to other ideas and instruction. And sometimes, physical corrections can be worth, 1,000 words. A lot of times I think we sometimes will overcoach, or we'll talk too much. I'm very guilty of it, being a New Yorker, right? But if, sometimes those physical corrections, showing someone actually physically moving their hand, moving their grip, and showing them something, can have a greater effect than just verbally coaching someone.
I think there's also something to that physical connection, from an instructor to an athlete, from a psychological component of like investment and comfortability. And you probably see that firsthand with your Brazilian jiu-jitsu. That's a lot of hands-on training. You talked a little bit about different learning styles earlier. What are some of those learning styles? So we have like the physical component, we have the hands-on learner. What are some other ways that you found that people learn differently, because we're not all the same individual? What are some of those different learning styles that you've kind of seen over the years and had to adapt your coaching and instructing to?
I would say one of the biggest, things that I've learned over the years is teaching, teenagers and young adults versus older adults. And it's something that I've been taught over the past few years. I've been very fortunate, and the FBI's SWAT program is managed by an organization up at Quantico that has done a very good job in bringing in a lot of outside organizations to better our training. And one of them being Mission Critical Teams Institute. They're great. They have a podcast. I encourage you to check them out. And one of the concepts that I was taught was adult learning theory. And much of what we were training in law enforcement, in the FBI, and many other organizations was essentially training what we would call the military model. So if you look at the military, right, most of the people in the military are 17 to about 25 years old. And, the brain is still developing, and the way that they learn is very different than an adult. And we found that, our approach to instruction, wasn't necessarily the best way. The military uses that crawl, walk, run, concept, and a lot of the skills that they teach. And there is a time and place for that. And I don't want to undermine that. But what we learned is, especially with adults, adults can tend to learn differently. And one of the things that we identified is, we would a lot of times start our training day and we would kind of build into it, right? We would start out with maybe simpler tasks, and then kind of as the day goes on, make the tasks more complex. And what we learned is that it's actually better. And this again is to a group of people who are experienced in the skill. This isn't, I would say brand new beginners, but we would essentially start the day with a more, a very difficult, complex scenario. And by doing that, that would bring out a lot of mistakes. We learned that, people would, especially adults, learn better when they're able to make those mistakes. And we would also use that as kind of an evaluation tool. So, we would do this. Let's say we did 2 exercises, very complex, and then we see mistakes. We can then, take those mistakes out, and then we can have what we call isolation training, or some people call it micro training, where you then isolate those skills that people are having problems with, and you can focus the rest of the training day on building those skills. And that kind of moves into, the Pareto principle. I'm a big believer in that. I don't know if you guys have ever heard that before. Some people call it the 80-20 rule. So that's something where it came from an Italian economist. And, the way that I understand it, easy way it was explained to me was in the terms of farming. So, imagine that you're a tomato farmer, you have, 100 acres of tomato crops. And year after year, when you harvest your tomatoes, you realize 20 of your acres, or 20% of your land, is giving you 80% of your crops, right? And I equate this to training. And I think it's something that we have to do as coaches, is, through our training and our experience, is identifying what is that 20% that's going to give you the 80%, 80% of your performance. And that's, that takes many years, right? That's something, and it's different for different athletes. It's different for coaches. But it's something that I've tried to, get better and better at over the years to make the instruction more efficient and get that learner, from A to Z quicker. And then the last thing I'll say about adult learning is, and I think this is something that, we could probably even do more with teenagers, is what we call exploratory learning. So, I teach a lot of firearms, and I have kind of shifted some of the way I do my instruction, in that, we would have a lot of times a fairly rigid program that we would come up with for the day, a training program. And what I found is that with a lot of adult learners, yes, we need to teach them the skill, show them, do demonstrations, right? Show them what proper technique looks like. But in some instances, it's good to let them then go off on their own and let them kind of figure things out on their own. And that we found a lot of success in that sort of exploratory learning model.
Yeah, something about training in the weight room it's almost like we don't, as coaches, want to give athletes the opportunity to explore and to feel, because we want to make ourselves feel important, maybe. Something James and I have talked about on here a couple different times. But that's so interesting you say that, and you've seen it work with different groups of people, adults and kids. And I think it's something that can definitely be applied to training more often for us as strength coaches in whatever setting we're in. I just want to make a comment on that. I want to go back a little bit before we dive too much into the weeds here with you, John. And I say this very tongue in cheek, because I want people to know, like, the last person I want to mess with is John Breen. So when I say this, I'm joking, but like, what made a computer science nerd from the Bronx want to go into the military? I know we have the little story from the beginning, but I'm sure it wasn't that. And then you decided you were going to go. So like, what really pushed you and made you want to get into the military?
Well, first, my family, I think it was a big part. Both my father and my grandfather served in the military. So I think that was an influential factor. And it's just something I always wanted to do as a kid. And when I was younger, it was probably harder to put into words, but now that I'm older and I kind of look back on it, and in general, it, you know, if you look at what I do now and even in the military, um, I'm a very principle oriented guy. And I like to help people, but also I believe in righting wrongs. That's just something that is part of my personality. I think there are people out there and that are, you know, that are designed to do that. And that's something that I just have always felt very strong about, is, you know, defending our country if necessary, and just being able to, you know, to serve and give back to my country. Because I mean, you know, despite everything that goes on in the news and, you know, what people say, I mean, I still believe we live in the greatest country in the world.
I asked because my oldest brother was a Green Beret for 22 years. And that was a question that I've asked him and heard his answer. And I just think it's such an unselfish decision. And I think it's so interesting because it never something that came to my mind. And James, I don't know where you stand on that, but I know I always so much appreciated my brother for what he did and for his service. Is there certain characteristics that you think individuals have, or experiences that individuals have growing up or in high school or in their youth, that kind of sends them in that direction? Or do you think, just from your experience, that everybody's kind of an individual case? And let me know if that's a little too broad of a question.
I think, you know, I think it's a combination of both. It's, you know, it's just like the whole nature nurture question about different things in life or personalities. And, you know, because I think I've seen both. You know, look at, you know, three brothers, right? You could have three brothers and they're raised under the same household, they have the same DNA, but then they all turn out differently, right? Whether their personalities, professions. So I think it's a combination. I think it's, you know, what sort of personality they have, what do they, you know, do they believe in giving back, and, you know, do they believe in something bigger than themselves? Because after all, that is probably one of the, you know, the greatest things is being part of something that's, you know, bigger than yourself. And, you know, I think when you're younger, it's harder. It's harder, like I said before, to put things into words when you're that teenager. I think there is a calling. I think some people just deep down inside, they have that calling, you know, but I think everybody joins for different reasons. I think it is very hard to kind of pinpoint one thing.
That's cool to hear. I do want to hear about some obstacles as well, because, you know, looking over your resume and hearing the story so far, people could maybe think, you know, I was driven since a young child to be in this position. I am here now. It was a very linear progression. I knew I was going to get here. These were the goals I set and I achieved them. What were some of the obstacles that you had to overcome? You know, maybe starting from when you first got into it, some things that happened that you didn't expect, or that you did expect, but were even a little tougher than you expected to be, you know, and then through college, through the ROTC, and through kind of moving up. What were some of the tough, you know, either conversations that you had to have with individuals, or tough situations that you were in that you thought maybe even for a split second that this isn't for me, this is too much, but you eventually overcame and then helped you become the guy you are today?
Yeah. So, you know, I'll start back to college, you know, and it was very challenging. I never forget my freshman year. You know, here I am, you know, I move away, I'm on my own, and, you know, I'm in the ROTC program, I'm an athlete, and I have a very difficult major of computer science. And, you know, I learned very quickly that, you know, it wasn't going to be easy. You know, I would have to wake up really early in the morning for training, you know, and then, you know, spend all day in school studying. And then usually we had, you know, a PM session of training. Sometimes I had RTC things at night, or on the weekends, and then juggling that with races. And quite honestly, it got to a point where, you know, I was I was almost at a point where I was getting pressured from both sides, where, I had my team, and we had races or practices, and then, RTC, we would have these training events on the weekends. And it was really hard. At one point, I was, I thought I was going to have to give something up. But I had some good leaders, and I still remember to this day, there was a general that came in and talked to our class one day in RTC. And believe it or not, and I felt it was very fitting for the time, new freshman. And, he could talk about all these things. He had a very successful career, and he spent the 20 minutes or so on time management. And it wasn't anything, like I said, he didn't have the recipe to ice, if you know what I mean. But he basically took a chalkboard at the time. I don't even think we had whiteboards. Is that bad? It shows how old I am. But, he took chalkboard and he drew a pie chart on the chalkboard. And he said, "This is your time." He said that pie is not going to grow. And then he started to make little sections, and he said, family, friends, school, sports, whatever, right? Hobbies. And, it was a very profound moment, because what I realized, when he said, when something is going to grow, i.e. if you start, becoming more dedicated in your sport or school or whatever that is, something else is going to suffer. And, I took that lesson with me throughout life. And I'm very hard on myself. I'm my own worst critic sometimes. And, I have a hard time saying no to people, and I'm very busy. And, sometimes you have to, in life, you have to sit down and you have to prioritize and figure out what's truly important to you. If you want to do well in something, you have to be willing to sacrifice maybe some of those other things, and in college, I mean, this sounds, trivial, but, some of my social life, it had to, I had to kind of taper that out, because I had to make extra time to study, extra time to work out, to do all these things. Another obstacle, I would say, is when I went in on active duty. So when you do RTC, you get training throughout college, and, I got to attend some schools, but for all intents and purposes, when you show up to your first assignment, most second lieutenants, they get to show up as what they call a platoon leader. So, imagine you're 22 years old, you just graduated college, and now you're on active duty, and you're put in charge of a platoon of approximately 30 soldiers, of which many of them are, almost some of them may be close to your parents' age, right? Or much older than you, much more experienced than you, and that was a daunting task, because here I am, I'm in charge of this group. However, I don't have 5% of most of their experience, whether it be in combat or just in the military in general. So learning how to lead and being humble and learning from them, quite honestly, was a very difficult challenge, because, here you're in charge of them, but you have to also understand, that, you're going to have to rely heavily upon them. And I would say that was one of the greatest experiences of my entire career, is the relationship between the commissioned officer and the non-commissioned officer. Just about every leadership position in the Army, there is a non-commissioned officer component. So when I was a platoon leader, I had a platoon sergeant. When I was a company commander, I had a first sergeant. And I still am good friends and still very close to a lot of my NCOs who I relied very heavily upon, throughout my military career. And they essentially shaped me and helped me become a better leader, and taught me to rely upon others, right? We can't do everything ourselves. We have to rely upon others, and it's okay as a leader or as a coach to not know everything, right? It's okay to say, hey, I don't know that. Quite honestly, people will respect you for admitting that. I think sometimes we're afraid to admit that to our athletes or to who we're teaching. But ultimately it's okay.
That reminds me of a quote that I heard way sooner than I got. And it's, if you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. And especially in our industry in strength and conditioning, like, coming out of college, we all know everything there is to know about strength and conditioning. We have all the solutions. We start working with athletes. Our way is the best way. We have the magic pill. And as we grow, sometimes we hopefully open our eyes to other solutions. And in our field and at T3 Performance, we do have to work with a lot of different strength and conditioning coaches that might have, baseline different philosophies, but our end goal is usually the same. Better outcomes for our athletes on the field, better outcomes for our athletes throughout the rest of their life. It took me a while to really learn that, and I'm still working on that, because I do, have my opinions and have my views. And I'm sure you probably see the same thing, when you were in the military and with the FBI. You have a lot of confident people that are, excited to get to work and want to do everything that they can to help now. What are some ways that you help some of the younger FBI agents kind of learn to work as a team together, learn to communicate with each other when people have differences of opinions?
So, you talked earlier about obstacles, and this is a good segue into what I would call, obstacles to learning. So, one of the things that I do if I'm teaching, if I'm teaching a new group, let's say of police officers, and, they don't know me, they probably don't know each other. So imagine in your world, if you had some sort of clinic where you brought in 20 athletes from a variety of teams, let's say, and everybody is, new to one another. They're probably a little uncomfortable. And, a lot of times I'll ask them right off the bat, I'll say, hey, what do you guys think are some of the obstacles to learning? And the example I give them is, there are individuals, let's say, police officers or in the military, that, they have a certain skill, let's say shooting, and, they 15 years later, and they're really not any better. And in some instances, they're worse, and I'll ask them, why do you think that is? And, you'll have a lot of people, and they'll tell you, the common reasons, right? Hey, they don't train enough. They're not getting good instruction. They're not putting in the repetitions, and so on and so forth. And a lot of those are true things. But I think in a lot of those instances, ego can come into play, and that's what we've seen over the years. And the the example again is, you're on the line with 20 different people. Everybody's looking at each other's targets, and everybody wants to impress the other person, maybe impress the instructor. And I think that is a huge obstacle to learning. Because we all have egos. Some people will say, I don't have an ego, but we all do. It's the reality. I mean, some have bigger ones than others. And so I tell them that right off the start. I talk about this openly. And I talk about that, when we go and we train, that it should be, self-improvement should be the goal, not comparing yourself to someone else, because it's very easy. We often find ourselves doing that. And, a lot of times if we just focus on that, when we focus on the process, we're going to do better. And the reason I think the ego is a big obstacle to learning is that if I were to take you and I put you on the shooting line, you're going to want to impress the person next to you. So you're going to do what you've always done. Right. And in order for you to get better, you're going to have to change. And a lot of times when we change, especially something we're doing for a long period of time, our performance tends to decrease initially. Right. And a lot of people have a hard time, dealing with that, and a hard time of like buying into that. So So I try to bring that up right off the bat. The other thing I like to do is I like to do an icebreaker. So I teach a breaching school every year, and you have 60 SWAT guys in this class, and a lot of them are very experienced, and it's a pretty serious room, and I go up in the front and I'll do a little introduction, and everybody's kind of feeling each other out. And what I started doing over the years is I would have everyone go around the room, introduce themselves, and one of the things that I have them do is I have them say something funny or interesting about yourself. And what I found was that, after the first few guys, people start sharing stories, funny, awkward stories, and the room starts laughing. And I feel like that does a good job, and that kind of helps break that ego down, and bring that down. And then the last thing I'll talk about is, performance versus outcome-based training, right? We've probably heard this before, and I feel like in life we a lot of times work on outcome-based training, right? If I were training you to draw a pistol and shoot at a certain target, and you're like, hey, I want to be able to do that in 1.2 seconds, and that's all you do, and you just keep focusing on that, you're probably not going to reach your goal, right? What we want to do is we want to do performance-based training where you get good at the skills, and then and trust and believe in that process to where then you will achieve those goals, right? We say in the shooting world, right, focus on the skills, not the drills, and building those skills.
Have there been specific qualities or specific strengths of the leaders that you've been around? I'm thinking us as strength coaches and people who run, let's say, team training sessions. We put ourselves in a leadership role. And I think it's important for us to be confident leaders. And a lot of times a big issue we see, and issues probably the wrong word, but with, maybe young kids coming out of school, or interns, or, athletes who eventually want to get into the role that we're in, is that they kind of lack confidence, and that doesn't help them. They don't really see the outcome about how they can be a good leader. Are there qualities and strengths of leaders that you think we can teach ourselves, or a path that we can take, or books we can read? Really, like, what does it take to go from somebody who is not confident and doesn't feel like a good leader to be in a position like yourself where you're able to, run training sessions with big groups of people? And that's kind of all over with that question. But I guess I'm just trying to figure out, the strengths and the qualities that it takes to be a good leader, and how can we find those within ourselves?
Yeah. So, I think you have to find your own leadership style. I think sometimes we try to maybe be somebody that we're not. While, I have had great leaders and great mentors throughout my entire career. And yes, I do try to mimic things that they do. However, I think one of the biggest things I learned was you have to be yourself. And, you talk about confidence. I truly believe confidence typically comes from being competent at something, right? Competence a lot of times will breed confidence. There's a great jiu-jitsu coach, and he's coached George St. Pierre and many other great UFC fighters. His name is John Danaher, and he's a brilliant instructor. I follow his Instagram. He was a philosophy professor at Columbia, very, very intelligent, has a PhD, and he revolutionized jiu-jitsu. I mean, his instruction is probably one of the best, that's out there. But one of the things he talks about is, he said that, not having skills but not having confidence is like having a lot of money in the bank but not being able to spend it, right? It's a very profound thing, and I kind of taken it one step further, and I call it, you have to have your debit card, right? That's your confidence, right? You You could use that thing anywhere, anytime. And that's something that, in my line of work, we have to have what we call performance on demand. It's one of those things where, in sports, there's a ton of parallels, I think, between the sports world and, tactical law enforcement, and we can learn a lot from each other. But the one difference in law enforcement is you don't typically get to pick the time and the place of when something happens, right? So you have to be prepared, and you have to be able to perform on demand at any time. So having that competence and having that confidence, is very, very important and can go a long way, especially in a critical incident, right? When you're not only, having to deal with a very stressful situation, but you might be in charge of individuals, and, let's face it, right? People's lives can be on the line, and that's a huge responsibility. Any sort of military leader or law enforcement leader, they are, in charge of individuals that, decisions that they make or fail to make could cause someone to get seriously injured or killed in one of these critical incidents. So that's why I think, having that competence and which will build and breed that confidence. The other aspect is, I think, forming relationships and trust. And this is something that I think we undervalue. I know I have for many years, and James, you kind of talked about it a little bit before, is we focus so much on becoming, proficient and learning as much as we can, and learning as many skills as we can, and the science behind things. But a lot of times, we can have our greatest impact on an athlete or on someone you're maybe in charge of or you're a manager of, is building a relationship and trust with that person. I saw it, about a week ago at T3 Performance. I was working out, and one of your younger coaches, he was coaching a group. It was a softball team, and he was running them through strength and conditioning, and as their finisher, he had them doing plate presses. Plate pushes. So for the listeners, if you're not familiar, you put, let's say, a 45-pound barbell plate on the ground, and then you put your hands on it, and then you have to push it, across the turf. And, it got to the end of the one exercise, and there was this one girl who had been struggling, and, she was the very last one, and she was trying to finish the workout. And this coach saw her struggling, and, he dropped down next to her, and he started pushing a plate next to her and started encouraging her. And, it was very impressive to see, because her team started to cheer for her, right, and encourage her. And she crossed the line, and you could just see, a smile on her face, and the confidence. And you could see the whole team, they came together and they cheered. And that's an example of, that wasn't skills, right? That was something else, right?
Coaches, it does not go unnoticed, right? I think a lot of
Mm-hmm.
times maybe we kind of are stuck in our own little area, in our own little world, and we don't think people recognize that stuff. So I appreciate you bringing that up, and that's
Yeah.
something that we try to push there at the facility, for leaders and for coaches and people who are running those groups, to really, like, show you care, right? Like you said earlier, be the best you possible, but show you care. And obviously we're in this position because we do care, and we care about, helping other people. This might kind of be a tough question to answer, but what do you think? Because we just talked about some strengths that leaders have. What do you think some of your greatest strengths are that help you be able to perform at the high level that you're at?
I think I'm a very hard worker. As I indicated before, I often struggle learning a new skill. I feel like, especially compared to some of my peers, and because I think of that struggle, that's enabled me to become a hard worker. And that's also enabled me to be a better coach and instructor, just because I feel like I know some of the struggles that those new learners go through. And we've all had those friends that just, they pick up a skill, instantly, and I'm not one of those people. I try to stay humble. I've been fortunate enough to work with, special operations and a lot of really high performers, professional athletes that, when you see what it takes to succeed at that level, it humbles you when you witness that, and see that. And then lastly, I would say communication. I think that's something that I've always tried to work on and continue to improve is, being a better communicator, whether, in writing, whether when I go out and do public speaking or, one-on-one with just, another person I'm teaching or helping on the mats. And then preparation is probably the other thing. I am very big on preparation. Whenever I'm going to teach a class, I will, try to review. I take notes. That's another big thing I encourage people to do is taking notes or videoing. Have someone who's a high performer at a skill and video them right at doing that skill. And then you can go back and watch that and look at all those little details. We all know about mirror neurons, right? And there's some studies on that. And being able to do that on demand.
John, as a parent and a badass parent, how are you able to, if at all, James and I know your daughter, pass all this information on to your next generation? And for parents who a lot of people our age are becoming parents, or I imagine struggling with a similar situation. How are you able to do that and pass all this info and all these qualities of, leadership and all that to your daughter?
The short answer is through you, our coaches. Unfortunately, I always say, you could have, the best athlete out there, you name it, Michael Jordan, right? I bet you in many instances, I don't even know if he has any kids, but if he has kids, they may not listen to him how to play basketball, right? It's one of those things. I think it's sometimes a challenge. I know it's a challenge for me to kind of try to share information with your children. But I think, when I get frustrated, but I think as I personally got older, and you may agree with this, I joked around with my parents once I became an adult, and I said, man, every year I felt like you got smarter and smarter. And, my parents weren't getting any smarter, right? I was realizing what they were saying many years ago actually was, good advice and probably were trying to set me on the right path. But it takes a lot of patience. And I think something that I'm not very good at is I'm a very direct person, almost to a fault. And I think, sometimes you have to find ways to subtly give your kids advice or information, as opposed to maybe, head on, and getting them to want to do things, right? That's the hardest part, I think, with being a parent sometimes is, getting them to want to excel, right? To want to work hard. And I just try to set a good example. That's probably, I think, the biggest thing as a parent is, I think if we set a good example with our children, that, hopefully they can mimic that and follow up, the work ethic. And, one of the jokes I have with my daughter is, I say, if I only worked out on days that I felt good, I'd probably work out once a week, that, sometimes you have to, work out when you don't feel well, or, maybe you're a little tired or you were up late studying, and you have to get out there every day and put forth the work.
That's so true. And kind of a great segue into the question about your training. Obviously, physically, you've been through a lot. You're still in great shape, and you're very active in what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. What does your training look like? How has it changed from, I have a note that you put on all that weight, 20 pounds of muscle in college. How has your training changed since then to now, to be able to keep up with the demands of your job?
Yeah, I talked about it before. I'm lucky in that, I think one of the successes in life is surrounding yourself with great people. And I've always been very fortunate to have, personal relationships with people like you and James and Zach and other people who have been able to help me in a variety of different ways. And one of the things that's helped me the most is, getting essentially like a functional movement screening, and identifying those weaknesses and those areas that I have a lot of injuries over the years between, military, SWAT, jiu-jitsu, and focusing more on mobility training. And as opposed to, we all have our inner meathead, right? I love lifting heavy weight like everybody else, but I've had to tone some of that down just because that risk reward, right? It's just, it's not worth it. We kind of are like a sports team, our SWAT team. And, if I'm injured, my team is counting on me to be there. And if I'm injured and I can't perform, right, that takes me away from my team, and my team counts on me. So I try to take that consideration, and I've found in some instances, less can be more. I think Ryan, he uses that phrase, what is it, minimum effective dose. And I do think that there's something to that. But I try to balance out my training. I usually do jiu-jitsu about 2 days a week. I try to do some striking here and there. And then I usually lift weights about 2 days a week and try to do some form of cardio or running another day. But that's kind of that's been my split lately, and it's been working out pretty well. I have to, temper down some of the intensity, and that's something else I've also learned is that, I would sometimes go to training, jiu-jitsu especially, and I would train really hard, and, I'm almost 45 and I'm rolling with, 22-year-olds. And so you can imagine, I mean, it requires a lot of physical effort and luckily technique. And, I would wake up the next day and my body would be wrecked. And then I would, have to take a day off, or, where I realized if I kind of tone some of the intensity down a little bit and train more frequently, I seem to have better results.
And I've got to ask this question, and James hates it, but being a fellow Whoop user, right? You're able to track your strain, you're able to track your sleep, you're able to track performance. What have you learned about yourself since starting to do that, that you've been able to kind of put into play?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of people have asked, they see that on my wrist and they're, what is that? And I'm a very analytical guy. And I know not everybody, it's not for everybody. And what I tell a lot of people is Whoop, it does two things for me. Whoop, one, it helps me better learn my habits and my body. And then the other thing is it tells me when not to work out. And that's seems a bit odd to say that, because, most people, I think, look at it as when can I push it hard? And, I'm one of those people, even if I'm tired or exhausted, a lot of times I'll end up going to the gym or go and work out or what have you. And, I'm a big believer in the phrase, your strengths can sometimes be your weaknesses. And that has caused me to, either get sick or in many instances get injured. right? I think you guys had something, I believe you talked about, fatigue and the correlation to injury. And I've directly experienced that on a number of occasions. So it's definitely helped dial in, I think, certain habits, everything from sleeping to diet. But it'll tell me kind of when to back things off. So I've found it very, very useful.
And James, I'm done giving Whoop free advertising. I just this is something that John and I talk about often, and it's interesting. So I had to ask.
And if you were wondering, I slept great last night. Didn't need an app to tell me
that. John, take us through what a day looks like for you. Like, a day in the life when you're not recording the Cutoffs and Coffee podcast with us. What's it look like? What are kind of the demands of the job these days?
Yeah. So one of the things that I would say I enjoy most about my job is that typically, no 2 days are the same. Depending on what I'm doing for the day, it could be anywhere from, if we have a SWAT mission, typically about once a week, we have a SWAT mission, so I'm up at a lot of times like 3 o'clock in the morning. In some instances I have to travel. We support other divisions. So we will travel out of state. So sometimes I'll leave the day before and drive to another state or another city, and, stay in a hotel. And a lot of times, that'll require, since I'm one of the leaders, we have to do a lot of mission planning. That's something a lot of people don't see or realize, but we put a lot of planning into a lot of our operations to keep us safe. It's very, very important. That's often overlooked. We've been very fortunate. We use a lot of my military training and a lot of the military planning process the FBI has adopted, and it's been very successful for us. So we'll do a lot of planning, and then our team will usually arrive and we'll do a briefing for our team. Sometimes we do rehearsals, and then we execute our warrants usually early in the morning. So those days, I may end up, I finish earlier, right? So I may start at 3 o'clock in the morning, and, I luckily will be home by, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, or I'll be at the gym, working out, or a different day where, I might, go into the office, and have to do paperwork, which is the dreaded aspect of my job. I always tell people, for every 5 minutes of fun, there's, probably 5+ hours of paperwork, right? And so, a lot of people will ask me, what is the FBI like? And the best way I can explain the FBI is, if you took corporate America, a police department, and the military, and you smush that together, that's kind of what the FBI is like. So it has different aspects and pieces of parts to that. So, in the office, sometimes I'll work on my cases. Like I said, I do counterterrorism investigations. And then, it could be anything. We could be out doing surveillance, going to interview people, you name it. And then another day could be training. So I could be out, on the firearms range, teaching a class, whether it be a bunch of police officers or some of the agents, or our SWAT team. And I'm out on the firing range all day, putting them through different drills and skill builders, and so it just varies. Every day is different. And that's one of the things I truly enjoy about the job.
I want to jump around a little bit here, John, because I got a ton of notes. You mentioned note taking, right? So a ton of notes here that I want to hit on as we kind of wrap it up. Not too soon, because I got a little too much to ask. But not a ton of continuity here. Airborne school. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. I mean, jumping out of airplanes. I did it once. Fascinating experience. Airborne school. I imagine it's something you do more often than once. So tell us about some of the experiences, some of the stuff you learned at airborne school, and just like what you learned about yourself from consistently jumping out of an airplane.
So I think I was 18 years old at the time. So I was pretty young. And so they break it up into different phases. So it's essentially a 3-week school down in Fort Benning, Georgia. So I was lucky enough. I think I went in May. So I remember at the time I had to make some arrangements with my professors. I had to take some of my finals early. And I traveled down to Fort Benning, Georgia, a very hot place, as you can imagine. And it's a very physical course. You know, they are essentially teaching you to jump out of what they call a perfectly good airplane, and you know, learn to understand your gear, understand how to check your canopy, how to deploy your reserve. They teach you all those things, but I would say the largest part of the course is teaching you the land. What a lot of people don't realize is, so there are different types of schools in the military for jumping out of planes. But the conventional, like what I did, which is what they call static line, where it's essentially conventional parachute. The goal of the parachute is to bring you to the ground as fast as possible, with essentially without seriously injuring you. So you fall at a very fast rate. I believe someone, and don't quote me on this, I think it's like the equivalent of jumping maybe like off an 8-foot ledge to the ground. That's about how fast you're falling. So they spend a lot of time doing what they call a parachute landing fall. So they have all these different contraptions that simulate you kind of, you know, swinging through the air, and then they let go of a rope, and you basically fall down, and you do a lot of training in these pits of sawdust. I vividly remember, you know, morning PT sessions, and, you know, they would take you on these long runs, and then they would have you do all these different exercises in sawdust. And I mean, you're sweaty, and it's going down your shirt and down your pants. And but ultimately, you know, they're trying to prepare you for that landing. You know, they're trying to strengthen your legs and your knees. And but, you know, injuries did happen, you know, and so the very last week you end up jumping out of the plane. You have to do 5 jumps to get what they call your wings. And you know, they go through this big long process. I mean, it's a very you talk about, you know, trusting your equipment. You know, the military, and I learned this going down there, that, you know, there are riggers. That's their job, is to pack parachutes. And as such, they have to jump their own parachutes at random. So it's a very good system in place, right? Because if they have to jump a chute pulled from what they packed at random, right, they're probably not going to, you know, slack on paying attention and doing everything, you know, with very detail oriented in mind. But it, you know, it was one of those things. You have to face your fears. You know, I like most people, I'm afraid of heights. I think most people are afraid. I think maybe to different varying degrees, because you hear some people that'll say, "Oh, I'm not afraid of heights." I think it's to a degree. But, you know, you have to face your fears, and it also taught you to trust your training. You know, they have a very good process. They put, you know, thousands and thousands of people through this school every year. And they do an excellent job at it. And, you know, they have the training down to a science, and they really prepare you well, to where, you know, when you make that first jump, I mean, you know, you're pretty scared, you know, but I can tell you, when I made my first jump and, you know, I hit the ground pretty hard, I was super excited, and I wanted to get back up there and, you know, do my next jump. But what I will say that's interesting, I would say, I think on maybe my 3rd or 4th jump, one of the individuals that was ahead of me had a problem, and he ended up getting badly injured, you know, and, you know, it definitely changed my mindset, you know, where I think when you're young, You think you're invincible. You don't really think of all the consequences of your actions and behaviors. And it was kind of interesting because you could see the shift in a lot of the people that I were in training with after this guy got injured. Everybody started to have a little bit of doubts of going back up there and jumping, but again, like anything in life, that adage of getting back on the horse, even if you fall off, you got to get back up there and go do it again.
And I'm assuming all 5 of these jumps are solo jumps, right? You're not.
Yes, they are.
Again,
these are not, like I said, these are not a free fall jump. So you have what's called a static line that's hooked up to a cable in the aircraft. So when you jump out of the aircraft, that static line pulls your parachute out and deploys your parachute. So you only fall for probably a few seconds before it opens up on you.
Man, we talk about training landing mechanics. I'm not sure, James, how how it could even get close to what they were doing. That's awesome.
Definitely not snap downs.
Definitely not single leg snap downs. So an impressive resume. Talked about a lot of stories, filled us in on a lot of your experiences. Do you have an accomplishment that you are most proud of so far that you've accomplished?
Yeah, I do. And it probably will surprise you because it doesn't have a whole lot of, well, it is related to my profession, but it's not related to, something that you would think. So, probably about 3 years ago now, I received a call. I was sitting at my desk one day and I got a call from our community outreach, and they received a call from an organization called A Special Wish. So A Special Wish is very similar to Make-A-Wish Foundation, very similar. And, they provide sick children with, trying to fulfill some of their dreams. And there was a 9-year-old girl named Olivia Hall who had a very serious form of brain cancer, very fatal. And her dream was to become an FBI agent. So I think because I had a young daughter at the time, and they asked if I would be essentially her training agent, and they had set up this day, Cleveland Police Department and the Cleveland Browns and a bunch of individuals. We set up this great day for her, where she would come in, she would get sworn in, she would get her own credentials, and then we put her through some training. And then they had this day set up where she would go around and investigate and kind of find clues. And then in the end, she ended up arresting Catwoman at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, which was pretty neat to be part of. And, I was honored to do this. And I just figured this was going to be like a one-day thing. And before, at the end of the day, this girl, Olivia, just phenomenal personality, just very outgoing. You can look her up on the internet. There's a ton of different videos that you can see. She was on the news multiple times, and she asked, hey, basically, can we exchange phone numbers? And we did. And next thing I knew, a relationship had formed where our families became close, and she was asking me to go to her treatments with her and some of her doctor's appointments, and we would do things together. And just to see her strength and, through that whole process was just, it was amazing. It really impacted me. A lot of people say, you did so much for her, but I felt the opposite. I felt like she did so much for me. And to see humanity, all the people that came out to help her, so many people rallied around her. I mean, she got to, I had people, friends call in favors where she got to meet the president of the United States, the director of the FBI. She got to go to Quantico and had an actual graduation, with all these people in attendance, and just to do all these amazing things. And she just was such a strong individual that that's probably my greatest experience or accomplishment was, being able to impact her life.
That's so cool and super powerful. And there is, like John said, you can a quick Google search and John, it comes up. Even if you just Google your name, you'll find a lot of information about her and what went on. Really cool. Some really cool articles out there that I read before we started the podcast. So I would send everybody over that way. And sorry, I should have saved that question till the end. Now I got like way lamer questions to wrap up with. But just a couple of things again to kind of, dive into your brain a little bit. Should be a little easier questions here. You talked about your love for the Yankees. Do you have a favorite all-time Yankee?
Don Mattingly by far. Yeah. Donnie Baseball.
Where's Derek Jeter lay in that list of yours?
He would be my number two. It just,
okay.
Derek Jeter was more, I would say, my favorite as I was a little older. So just different generations, I guess.
Sure.
But that's probably my number one and two for sure.
Okay. How about a favorite sports movie? If you have one.
Believe it or not, it's a movie called Without Limits. Have you ever heard of it?
No,
I haven't.
Highly recommend it.
Add it to the list.
Yeah, it's about the life of Steve Prefontaine, and very inspirational movie, I would say. Kind of goes into mindset. I think it's a great movie to show, especially maybe like teenagers, in that, it just shows the mindset that he had and what caused him to succeed, at that high level of the Olympics.
That's right. As soon as you started talking about that, I thought my dad's a big Steve Prefontaine fan, so I should have seen it. If not, we'll have to check it out. How about do you have a favorite? Maybe is a interesting word to use, but military based movie. Kind of more on your side. There is there a movie that you watch that you enjoy watching that is kind of based around the FBI or the military?
Yeah, my favorite military movie, We Were Soldiers, I would say, is probably one of my favorite movies. Mel Gibson, he stars in that. And then, believe it or not, there is a movie about the FBI. I think it's called Untraceable, and the actor in the movie, I kid you not, his name is John Breen, and which is unbelievable. So someday I hope I get to maybe meet that actor, because
John Breen. All right, not to be confused. Okay, how about book recommendations? Do you have any that you would send people to, or that you recommend often to people?
Yeah, there's quite a few books. I'm trying to think of the one. So there's a book there's written by a guy named Josh Wadeskin, and he was a chess prodigy. If you've ever heard of that movie, Finding Bobby Fischer, that movie was made essentially after his life, and it's called The Art of Learning. And I really like this book a lot. I think it would help. I mean, anywhere from a teenager to an adult get better at learning, right? That's essentially what we all try to do, is getting better at learning things.
We'll have to check that out. Okay. Is there anything that we haven't hit on that you wanted to touch on, John? I know we've kind of covered a lot of stuff, but I want to give you the opportunity if there's any big points that we've missed to be able to hit on real quick.
Yeah, I mean, the only probably the last two things that I would say is talking about mental performance. I think that's something that we often, I think we've only scratched the surface in both the sports and tactical law enforcement community. I know a lot of professional athletes have focused in this area for years, but I think that's something that we're going to see, and we need to get better in the future. I know at T3 Performance, I mean, you guys do a great job. You have Molly down there, and I just listened to her recent webcast, which was excellent. It was, for parents. And I think, giving, especially I think teenagers and children, the tools to succeed, right? Because I know that's something that, looking back on especially my high school days, I think that was part of the reason as well. I didn't have some of those tools to help deal with maybe the stresses of competing and being able to perform when the pressure was on, and then the other is being open-minded. And this is something I feel like the older I get, the more open-minded that I've become. And I jokingly tell people when I teach classes, especially if it's a skill-based class like shooting, I'll tell them, I hope that in 5 or 10 years, if you were to come back and find me, that I'm teaching this a different way or a better way, right? And I use the analogy of squatting, right? How many years were we told, like, don't put your knees over your toes, right? That was, a big adage for many years. And then not until probably recently has a lot of this fitness community, have obviously the knees over toes guy helped, kind of propagate that information. But I equate it to the same thing in things that I do. Our shooting stance, 10 years ago looks nothing like what we teach today. We didn't realize at the time, but it was very unnatural. It was very fatiguing. It just didn't, it was what we knew at the time. We thought what was best. But then we look at where we are today, and our new shooting stance that we do when we teach today is much more upright. It's natural. It's less fatiguing. It offers better situational awareness, better mobility. So I think we have to be open-minded to learning, new and better ways to do things, and to continue to experiment, and to not always think that, how just because you did something for 5 years, it's the best or most effective way.
And we always wrap up with what you think, John, we're missing in the performance industry. Would you say focus on mental performance training and keeping an open mind, or two are the two big blocks that you think we're missing?
Yeah, and I would say the third thing would be master the basics. I think there's brilliance in the basics. Going back to what I talked about before, that Pareto principle. I think we all have to identify what is that 20% that's going to give us 80% of our results. And that's always going to be changing, and you're going to be tweaking that both as an athlete or a coach. But I think we should always keep striving to tweaking that and experimenting and striving to find that, so that we can train harder, right? Train smarter, not harder.
That's awesome. And John, we always wrap up with asking, and we laughed a little bit about this before we recorded, like, where can we find you if people are interested in finding you and talking to you? And usually the conversation is social media, but it's a little different in this situation. Where can we find you, John, if somebody wants to have a conversation with you?
Yeah, you could find me at the gym, the jiu-jitsu mats, or probably the shooting range. That's usually where I'm at.
I love that. It's funny, when we were talking about that earlier, the last thing I'll say is the first class, and this is a weird story to bring up, and I think only one other human being knows this. He was my roommate at the time. First class I signed up for in 2005 when I enrolled at Indiana University was Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And it was 8 a.m. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I signed up for it because it fit like the time that I was used to going to school. Because I didn't want to start at 9. I didn't want to start at 10. I was trying to get stuff out of the way. And so I told my college roommate after I came back to the dorms that I signed up for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu on Monday morning, which was going to be my first class that I ever took in college. And he was like, dude, do you know what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is? And I didn't. And because it wasn't quite popular yet. Again, it was, 2005. So a while ago. And, he was like, no, dude, you don't want to do that. So I dropped the course. And then the more conversations I have, like with you and with Bobby, with Coach Bobby Cleo, I think dang, I should have just gone to that. I should have just gone to the orientation. I should have gone to the first day and then fallen in love with it. Like you guys have. Is that something that maybe James and I should think about picking up in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is by far one of my favorite things to do. And I really think it's never too late. You guys are amazing athletes, and I think you'd both do really well at it. But it's very it's not only a very physical thing, but it really is a mentally stimulating activity. I oftentimes, it's described as human chess, or a lot of times I'll tell people it's problem solving under duress, right? Because you have to, you're exhausted at times. Sometimes you're going against someone maybe that's stronger than you, that's bigger than you. And that's what, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu ultimate was designed for a smaller opponent to defeat a larger opponent. If you watch the early UFC days and you see Royce out there, Royce was, about my size, maybe even a little smaller, about 180 pounds, almost 6 foot. He wasn't a huge guy. And, through technique, he was able to win a lot of those fights. And that's, it's a great life lesson, right? Learning to be calm under pressure, learning to deal with adversity. It's a very humbling sport, right? There are very few activities that you go to where you essentially have to tap out or essentially say uncle to another grown man. And we see a lot of people that come through they don't stay. And it's not because of, in some people it's a little too physically demanding for them, but a lot of people it's ego. A lot of people can't handle that, that defeat or having to essentially, tap out. But it's taught me a lot about myself, and it's carried over on countless times, especially from a mental perspective, to, when I'm out with work and I may have a very stressful or chaotic situation, it teaches you to be comfortable in uncomfortable situations, which is, I think very important for life. That's kind of like why I try to do a different, learn something new every year, right? So you can it's a little uncomfortable, right, when you're a beginner. But I highly recommend it to the audience. I have my shirt on. Shameless plug to my professor Rocco at Levitate Jiu-Jitsu out in Amherst. It's a great school. If anybody's in the area and they want to train, definitely find a school. I can't say enough good things about it.
Yeah, we definitely have to look into that.
We'll have to join you. We'll have to join you one of these days.
Would love it.
I'm glad it wasn't popular when I was in school, because running around with football guys, it was always the big guys getting in the big fights, the bigger linemen and linebackers getting in fights. Now you can't mess with anybody when you're out at bars, because you might have a 510-pound Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu master, submit one of these guys without them even, being able to blink before it happens. So, gotta keep your eye out for those. But John, thanks so much for joining us. This has been episode 32. If you made it this far, we appreciate y'all listening. We are looking forward to the next one, but I hope you enjoyed a ton of what we talked about here from John. I think there's a lot of things that we can take away, and use in our daily life to be able to get better and be able to become better human beings and become better leaders. So again, we always ask you, listeners, do 3 things for us as we wrap up here the podcast. Please continue to practice gratitude. Tell the people that you love them every single day. And remember, we got one life to live. We might as well live this life stimulated. Thanks everybody for listening. We will catch you on the next one.